Now, so this is kind of an old trope now, but I'll keep saying anyway that there is almost always, if not always, a connection between the first reading and the gospel. And that remains true for our plowing through this, and it will remain true for the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. So this is from the prophet Ezekiel. I put a box around the main part of this reading, and this is the one that will find a parallel in the gospel. So first you need to know, as background to this, by this time, the nation of the Hebrews is destroyed as a corporate entity. And so Ezekiel says he cannot do anything other than try to keep going to the individuals to tell them the message of God. Because as a country, they're moved into exile, and their motherland is destroyed. So that's why in what is in the box, God is saying to Ezekiel, go to the people. Your job is to be faithful to your prophetic mission, even though the country as a country doesn't exist anymore. And your prophetic mission is to keep telling the people my message. Now, I highlighted the word watchman because that's very, very familiar to people in this age. That was the role of a watchman was common, a familiar figure in the defense of the defense system of Palestine, and for that matter, most other ancient groupings. So the watchman would have watches. We've talked about that before. Like the Romans divided 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. into 4 watches of 3 hours each. So watchmen would take turns, relieve one another, so that always there would be somebody on the lookout. So the metaphor of watchmen, which was very familiar to Ezekiel's audience, is specifically used so that they get it. He's going to stay faithful to the job God gave him, as a watchman is faithful to guarding the city. So it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but also it gives you pause. So this is God speaking. If I tell the wicked one that he's going to die, and you don't try to get the person on the right way, and he never does, or she never does act who she is as, or he is as a child of God, and dies in the guilt, you, Ezekiel, will be responsible if you don't try to warn the person. Even if the person doesn't change and dies in her guilt or his guilt, you are responsible. But if you do try to warn them and they don't change and they die in their guilt, I will not hold you responsible, because you did what I was asking you to do. You were accountable to me and responsible to your prophetic mission. So it's pretty straightforward. And that's really what there is. And this whole piece about being responsible for one another is what transposes to the gospel. I separated this into parts, 4 parts actually, because there are 3 parts to what Jesus is trying to tell his disciples to do, in the same vein as God wanted Ezekiel to do. We can't ignore wrong. We can't ignore wrong. But there are 3 parts to that, and then another part which wraps it up in love. Okay, now, so when you read it, so you can see the 4 sections, almost kind of like 4 stanzas almost. So I separated it according to that. And the first 3 go with the protocol, pretty straightforward, that Jesus is suggesting for addressing something wrong. So before we break this apart, I just want to give you a little context for it, a little background for it, because what I want you to do is, as we go through this, I want you to remember that everything in this gospel is held in what I'm going to tell you now. The important part of this is to repair the relationship. Hear me say this: no matter whose fault it is. in God's mind, the important thing is to repair the relationship. Now, this can put a glaring light on all, if not most of us, because I would imagine that for a good many, if not most of us, if we are the one who have been wronged, then we would love it if the other person would come and apologize first, because after all, she was the one that wronged me. Jesus is saying the important thing is to repair the relationship. That's not easy. I think it's one of these non-negotiables, which are part of the very, very compact heart of who we are as Christians, just like loving and praying for your enemy. This is another non-negotiable, I think. The relationship is important. This month's lectionary cycle from Matthew will be giving us a lot of virtues and vices, which are contrasting sets, which can foster relationships or destroy relationships. So we're going to be seeing this, and in fact, if we look back at the past weeks, we can see that too. It's about relationship. And Jesus' point in all this is that the relationship must be protected, loved, nurtured, and made right. Because our human relationships mirror our relationship with God. Now think of that. If you take that one step further, then you're saying that it can reflect a broken relationship among people that we know here, can certainly reflect on or reflect our relationship with God. It can taint it. We can justify it away in our minds and make us think we're still okay with God when we're not.
Yes.
So this is really, really important. We're going to be given a reasonable protocol with this, but at any rate, then you also need to know that right in front of this pericope, Matthew talks about the parable of the shepherd and the lost sheep, where the shepherd goes out and finds the one that's lost and brings him back. That's deliberately done because the model for this protocol Jesus is going to give you is that you always go after the wanderer, the lost sister or brother with love. What motivates the shepherd is love for the whole, that motivates him to go out in a caring way for the one that's lost. And that sets up this protocol that Jesus is going to give us. So community life is the great testing ground of faith. You know, it's easier, it's harder to do what we're called to do as belonging to Jesus Christ in faith and living out of this faith and living out of this belonging. It's harder to do in community when you keep hitting the walls of other people who like different things as you, have different tastes as you, sometimes oppose you, push back. One of the first lessons when you enter the convent is that. The testing ground for the mettle, M-E-T-T-L-E, mettle of who you are is community life. That's when you're going to run up against who you really are. And it is true. Family life is another community, right? Church life is another community. Religious life lived in community, another one. Dorothy Day was wise enough to see that the injustice and exploitation that was all over the world that she was trying to stand against played out in the small service communities of Catholic worker that she helped establish. She was a wise woman. The great grandiose things that were painted on the broad stage of the world, you could find them in the tiny little Catholic worker house on 12th Street. She was a wise woman. This is where we come to terms. We start to see who we are, really, and then we're called and invited to, with the help and presence of God, to move past that to be a community creating person. Okay, now let's look at this reasonable protocol, all of which needs to be done in the spirit of Jesus Christ. Jesus said to his disciples. If you're brother, okay. Brother is Bible speak for fellow disciples. And before we go farther, I want to say that this pericope is strangely discordant to the general tone of the gospel, because it escalates, as you can see, it escalates into stronger and stronger actions, which end in the separation permanently, excommunicating the person who won't change. That's absolutely opposite to this arc that I keep talking about, that the arc of Jesus Christ on earth and the arc of God in history is overwhelmingly in gathering. So this is different to that. And I think the reason it's different is this is yet another pericope that most likely has its origins in the post-resurrection apostolic church. They were starting to run into trouble with Jesus gone and the Spirit coming in Pentecost. And they needed something in order to address this. Because remember, the point of this in Jesus' eye is that it has to be addressed. Okay, now, if your brother sins against you, now what we're reading and what's going to be proclaimed, although obviously this won't be seen on Sunday, usually what I highlighted against you is in brackets, because in the earliest Greek texts, against you is not included. And see if you remove that, how it changes completely the sense of what's happening, because it can be personal. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. But it's personal, very easy. No, I won't say very easy. Much easier to do this when it's a personal fault. So between my brother and me, it's much, if my brother does something to me and I go to him and I say, John, I was really hurt when you said that to me. It's more possible to do that way. But look at what happens when you take out that against you, which was not part of the oldest Greek manuscripts. If your brother sins, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won over your brother. So this is if your brother sins, comma, any kind of a sin, not just against you. Do you see what we're being invited to do? We're being invited to get a sense of ownership for the community as a whole and to pay attention. Here's the important part, past ourselves alone, which I think is difficult in the world now when we tend to be put back just on ourselves alone. So if you take out the against you, which I wish it would on Sunday, but it won't because bishops already did this. If your brother sins, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now this three-pronged protocol was actually one that was already established in an early pre-Jesus Christ community at Qumran, called a group called the Essenes, who lived not far from the place in the Jordan River where Jesus was baptized. And in their community, they practiced this. Okay, so that's the first one. Then the second one, thank you. If he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, the reason I highlighted what I did is because in Deuteronomy, in the law for the Hebrew people, 1 witness would never convict. They specified 2 witnesses. The Deuteronomic law asked for 2 witnesses, that you could never be convicted on just the testimony of 1. Okay, and still it's rather private, at least it's not shamefully public. And then it goes on to the third part of the protocol. If he refuses to listen to them, then tell the church. See, this is another hint that this is probably a pericope that was inserted into Matthew after the resurrection, because that word church wasn't used by Jesus. Remember, we talked about that. As well as this whole problem reflects more accurately a problem of the early church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. In other words, this would have been very sensitive to Matthew's Jewish audience, because they seriously took the prohibitions of interacting with Gentiles or tax collectors. Remember, some of those tax collectors were former Jews who were working for the occupying force, like Zacchaeus, like Matthew was. Okay, so they were considered traitors and thereby anathema. They were abolished and separated and isolated from them as a group. And they took that seriously. A couple of weeks ago, in one of the gospel messages, Jesus was talking to the woman that he had that bantering back and forth with about would he come and cure her child. And then he said, oh, but you're not supposed to give the food to the dogs. And she, that whole thing. Okay, Jesus in that story did not enter the Gentile territory because he took seriously what the law prohibited about going onto Gentile property, on Gentile land. So this would have been a really a very strong hallmark to the ears of the early church. So do you see what Jesus is saying to the church now? If someone is so intransigent that they will not change, then that presumes arrogance. And that kind of arrogance is not part of the definition of church, and which is far more broad, as you'll see in a second, than what we think of it now. So if he refuses to listen, tell the church, and if then he refuses, then you treat him as you would a Gentile or tax collector. In other words, you don't have a thing to do with this person because there's not any sense of turning around the life and coming back, which of course would have made the person welcome. Okay, then this is the important part. Amen, I say to you. In English, we don't see this as well, but that you is plural. Now, the other words I highlighted, the binding and loosing, were a couple of weeks ago, a power is given to Peter as head of the church. What you bind shall be bound, what you loose shall be loosed. Now, this you, and in Greek it is plural, now this binding and loosing power is being given to the whole church, to the whole assembly. The binding and loosing have the force of condemning and acquitting. And that condemning and acquitting by these words, that power is given to the whole assembly, not a maverick rogue person acting on her own or his own, but on the assembly gathered in the Spirit of God. That's why you can't excommunicate unless it's the gathered assembly that listens, offers a plan to be welcomed back into the church or not. That belongs, hear me, that's important. It belongs to the assembly, because what I want you to understand is the whole apostolic church, the acts were of the church as an assembly, not the acts of the officers like the apostles. That doesn't deny that Peter is the head of this church. But the jurisdiction, it truly was an assembly, The power belonged to the gathered church, gathered in the Spirit. So this is another thing that reflects that this is addressing a problem of the early church, because this is actually something that's happening as the church is getting more developed. And let me say something else about the plural use of the word you. We have to remember, whenever we're in liturgy, that we are not acting just in our separate parishes, like here at St. Benedict the African, or at St. Sabina's, or, I'm sorry that I don't remember the Los Angeles.
Catherine Drexel.
Thank you. Oh, and Catherine Drexel. And I can't remember the people who are joining us from other states. Okay, so wherever, we tend, because there's almost like a spirit, a cachet, to liturgy at all of the different places. We tend to kind of get comfortable in one place, but we can never forget that we are acting as one part of a whole church. So much so that this is what's true. In the letters of Paul, sometimes he will start, especially at the beginning of the letters, if you're reading that in church, he will say, brothers and sisters, I say to you. Okay, so like at the mother house, at our mother house, where except for the priest, it's all women, the sister who's reading cannot turn around and say, brother, and then turn back to the choir of sisters and say, and sisters, because it is not just for the Mother House Chapel in Springfield, Illinois. It is one expression of worshiping God that belongs to the Church Universal. So the sister says, brothers and sisters. You don't kind of rip it apart from the universality of it to make it particular and specific just to us. And that's something liturgically that we need to remember. We are speaking as part of and on behalf of a church universal. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the next part down, please. Again, I say to you, if two or of you agree on earth about anything for which they are to pray, it shall be granted to them by my heavenly Father. For where two or three are gathered together in my, notice the qualifier, in my name. Same thing with the community excommunicating. It's got to be the gathered assembly in the Spirit who listens and decides if excommunication is necessary. So the two or three have to be gathered in the name of Jesus, and there am I. Two or three, there am I. Two or three, there am I. This actually had its roots from a Jewish rabbi who was killed a little more than 100 years before Jesus was born in one of the several revolts of the Jews against the Romans. And this rabbi was executed. And what he said was, when two or three sit, there are between them the words of the Torah, that is, the divine presence rests on them. This is building on that same rabbi's thing. Now here's what I think is just so strong and beautiful about that. If you remember that when two or three are gathered, there is Jesus. When you are conscious of bringing Jesus along with you into life, it permits to see how present Christ is in our lives. Or two or three. Now, when Sister Mary and I would go over to the hospital to Mass, it most of the time is the priest and the two of us. But the doors are open to the chapel. It's announced over the intercom. There is a sense in the hospital that this prayer is being offered for the people there in the hospital, sick and visiting and recuperating from surgery and in the emergency room. There is that sense of the largeness of the prayer that the three of us in the chapel can keep going for them. So the good part of this idea of presence is it helps us to remember that if we have this awareness of Jesus present, then we have this awareness of divine life. And then moving forward with that, we have the sense of Christ being the invisible party in the group, even if it's just one other person that we're meeting. Christ would make three. So it's a kind of a way of softening an uncharacteristically difficult and challenging pericope or gospel passage, but it brings it back into the presence of Jesus, which is important and true. Now, having said this last thing, let me go back and just say one other thing. And this, I think, a lot of you know already. Sometimes when someone you know, either friend or family, goes astray in any way, I'm not just talking about in faith or socially or however it could be, is it not kind of automatic that if, let's say it's a family member, that the family will decide, you know what, you know him best. You know his heart. Go and talk to him so that his heart can be back here where it belongs. Doesn't that kind of happen organically in many families? You know, maybe not all, but like maybe grandma is better with this one person, or maybe the auntie, or anybody, maybe somebody in church. But this is why the end of that gospel is actually important in reflecting on the three-part protocol that preceded it. It all has to be rooted in the love of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a lovely invitation. And here's the part that is challenging, that I think is personally challenging, but also very important. We can't not speak if something is wrong. And notice, if you take out the against you in the first part of the gospel, it's not just if there's something done wrong to me. That's why I wish that were taken out Sunday. But if there's something wrong, you can't not speak, because of the truth and the power of the communion of people in Jesus Christ. That, to me, is just worth an awful lot of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And then remembering that what you bring to the, I'll say, confrontation, has to be the truth and love of Jesus Christ to that. So I think it's a very strong, it's deceptively strong, I think, the gospel is.